This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to Plain Talk. This is your host, Rob Port, joined as usual on Wednesdays by my co-host, Chad Oban. And we got a really busy show today. In a moment, going to be speaking with State Representative Michael Howe. He is a Republican from West Fargo. I was going to say the Fargo area, but that's not very fair to the West Fargo community. Everybody does that to West Fargo all the time. It's this whole other city that's just, it's completely indiscernible from the rest of Fargo, but it's this whole other city, West Fargo. And Michael Howe, he represents that area, and he's going to be on. But before we get started, I got to do my usual spiel and get you folks to subscribe to the podcast via a podcasting app. That would be fantastic, because then your phone will notify you when you have new episodes. You'll be more likely to tune in, and I'll be more likely to make money. That's what this whole thing is about. Also, speaking of money, you should subscribe to the Fargo Forum and the Grand Forks Herald and the Dickinson Press. It's all one subscription. You get all of our papers. We got papers across Minnesota. We even got papers in Wisconsin. They're everywhere. It's $10 a month. It's one low price. Easiest place to go to subscribe, inforum.com/subscribe. I suppose that works for like Grand Forks Herald or Dickinson Press. But anyway, you subscribe one place, you subscribe to them all. It's all the same thing. So do all that fun stuff. And now, let's get to the interview. And Representative Howe, first of all, congratulations. You got married. He was just complaining that I texted him and asked him for an interview on his right as he was leaving for his honeymoon. I ambushed him. I caught him.
Well,
and against his better, he was still groggy, so against his better judgment, he agreed.
Well, yeah, thank you, Rob. I did get married on New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, first day of our marriage. Both my wife's cars and both my wife and I's cars did not start. And then we went promptly on our honeymoon later that afternoon, and it was one of the worst travel days I've ever experienced. So the first 48 hours of marriage, if we were able to survive that, I think we're doing okay. She's still with me, by the way.
My sister got married, and they decided to go camping. They got married in August, and then decided to go camping for their honeymoon. And we're trying to pitch a tent, and it was like a billion, it's August in North Dakota, so it's like 1,000,000 degrees outside. And they almost got divorced. Like the weekend they got married, trying to pitch this tent in the 100-degree heat. I think my dad had to go down and like pitch the tent for them. It was terrible.
Well, that's got to make your brother-in-law feel good that his father-in-law to come down and pitch the tent.
Right, that's always a good step. That's always a good step as your wife calls your father-in-law. That makes any husband feel super good about himself. His father-in-law shows up to do the man stuff that you're not man enough to do. That's always great.
Let me pitch that tent for you, son. I'll teach you some things about being a man. Maybe
I shouldn't admit this, since both Katie and my car were in opposite spots. We had no way to charge our vehicles, so my dad had to come and charge our vehicle, so her father-in-law had to come and be the hero.
Yeah, well, winter in North Dakota, it's always an adventure. Mike, I wanted to have you on because a couple weeks ago, or several weeks ago now, I was calling around trying to find out who was Governor Burgum was maybe going to appoint, or who was interested in being a replacement for Tax Commissioner Ryan Rauschenberger. And your name was one that popped up, and I called you, and you said, Tax Commissioner, I'm running for Secretary of State, is what you said. So I wanted to have you on to talk about that. I guess I'm announcing it for you. Are you going to run?
Rob, I guess I'll correct you. I did not say I'm running for Secretary of State when we called. I said that was something I was looking at.
All right.
And I did tell you that I think that was mid-December back then, Rob. But still in the stages of planning a wedding and a honeymoon and doing all that. And I said that was my main focus. Now here we are. I'm married. We came back from our honeymoon, and I'm still taking a very strong look at that office. I know with district convention starting up, the NDGOP convention is we're about 3 months away now.
Yeah.
So time is of the essence, but I'm doing my due diligence of looking at what it would take to run a statewide campaign. And if that's something that's now in my wife's and I's future.
What is it I'm sorry, go ahead, Chad.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you're going through that consideration, what makes the office appealing to you? I mean, from my perspective, the Secretary of State's office and what's been going on in this country has the potential of being a pretty controversial office. What makes it appealing to you now to run?
Well, the Secretary of State's office, it administers our elections. It's also, you have access to every single business in the state. My record in the legislature, I think, has shown I'm a very pro-business legislator. I think there's some opportunities there. I think, North Dakota, we're a pro-business state. I think it's easy to do business in North Dakota. I don't know necessarily if it's easy to start a business in North Dakota. And that's something that's very appealing to me. Our economy's humming. We've recovered, I think, quite nicely through this pandemic. I just think there's a lot of opportunity there with an office like the Secretary of State to really make some changes. We've had, I think Secretary Jager's been there since 1992. I was in kindergarten then. Before him, we had the Democrat for 4 years. And then prior to him was Ben Mayer, who was there for 40 or 50 years. So we've had three people in that office really since the 1930s. And I think it's and plenty of opportunity to make change and really influence how North Dakota does business.
That's been an issue with the Secretary of State's office, which you're talking about, the business licensing aspect of it.
Yeah.
And that's been, I remember during the Bakken oil boom. That was a thing where they were saying, in Texas, they have the business permit, in like a week or so, and in North Dakota, it was taking months at times. Is that what you're talking about? Because it seems like that's been a perennial issue. Every time the Secretary of State's been on the ballot, we're talking about that issue.
Right. Yeah, I know in the boom days of the Bakken, they were weeks out of getting a business license. I think you hear some horror stories of it took 10 weeks to get a business license. Well, we all know time is money. To Secretary Jager's credit in that office, they've, I think, significantly improved that. But part of me goes, why can't we have same-day business registration? I think that's what that office should be striving for. Now, whether they get there or not, to be determined. But I think that's something that certainly could be a potential and a possibility. And why not?
So this issue has been around forever. I rember going back to when Corey Mock ran against Al Jager. Yeah. This was one of the issues. Last campaign, I think both Will Gardner and Josh Boucher brought it up. Why didn't the legislature do something about this issue rather than waiting for Jager to make the decision? It just seems like if this has been an issue for 20 years and we're so pro-business, it seems like the legislature could have stepped in and done something. Why do you think that wasn't done?
Sure. To answer that, Chad, I don't know. I guess when you look at my duties in the legislature, sure, I vote on every budget, vote on a lot of policy bills, but that's not something I guess I had the opportunity to really examine. I think there has been efforts. I know that conversation has happened in the legislature as far as specific policy or funding to address that issue. I can't say if that was something the legislature did. My first session was 2017. I think in the 2013, 2015 sessions, when there was a really large lag time of applying for a business license, I think it had improved. So maybe it was something, hey, you know what, they're getting better at it. We'll let that dog sleep for now.
Well, part of it too, the Bakken oil boom subsided. Obviously it's still very economically important, but the boom is over. Let's switch gears and talk about the election side of it too, because as important as the business filings and all that is, the Secretary of State has a lot of duties. As important as all that is, elections are very much on the minds of Americans. There are people out there saying that there was all this election fraud. There's even people in North Dakota who are trying to insinuate that our last election results were fraudulent or were impacted by fraud, which I do not agree with. I don't think there's a factual case to be made for that at all, but you can't ignore the fact that that's an issue. So as you're looking at that landscape thinking, I may potentially want to be Secretary of State, how do you, and I want to, because I want to be very clear, I don't think that there was fraud that impacted North Dakota's elections or that impacted the outcome of the national election, but how do you address that perception? Because perception is reality in politics. How do you say to people, you can trust our vote?
Well, I think we talk about what should be improved in the office, communication and transparency. I'm not aware that the Secretary of State's office has a communication arm. I think they do work.
I get the press releases. It's just Al sending an email.
Yeah. So, I mean,
which I appreciate in some ways.
That's
a very North Dakota thing.
Yeah, I guess that's government efficiency at its finest right there. But I think the Secretary of State's office could be out there more, holding more events with counties. I think I'm not on the Government and Veterans Affairs Committee, but I'd heard that the Association of Counties brought the election equipment to the committee, say, hey, this is how it's done, this is how it works. And some of the detractors and maybe some people that were questioning the election results said, hey, you know what, I guess things in North Dakota are run okay. So I think communication right there, Rob, is key of getting that message out of we are doing things all right. Now, as it relates to North Dakota and a fraudulent election, well, I can't go on and say it was a fraudulent election. I was elected in 2020. I'm not going to say I was fraudulently elected to the North Dakota legislature. I just can't say that. And nor do I believe it either.
Yeah. So on that sort of subject, over the weekend, Senator Mike Rounds from South Dakota said the election was not stolen. It's almost like saying elections weren't stolen is sort of a profiles in courage these days, right? I mean, he said it, then the former president just ripped him apart. There's an AP article, Congressman Armstrong, to his credit, said people who are saying the election was stolen are silly, but did recognize the vast majority, or I shouldn't say the vast, a big chunk of North Dakotans do believe that. I mean, what do you think about, it sort of goes back to that previous question. It's not just about North Dakota elections. You're going to be part of this 50-state network where the integrity of our elections are being questioned. First, do you think Joe Biden was elected in 2020? Do you think is a fair election? But secondly, how do we get past this? Rob and I have talked a lot about, in 2024, if the Democrat loses, are Democrats going to be doing the same thing that's happening on the right now? And that's a bad cycle for this country to get into.
Well, we can look at what's happening in Washington right now, the discussion of nationalizing our elections. I think that would be a terrible idea. North Dakota Secretary of State administers the elections. The counties run at the local level. I think it's safe to say in North Dakota, you can talk to your county administrator. A lot of people know these people. This is your friends. This is your neighbors. Let's keep it that way. Let's not have taxpayer-funded elections. Let's not have a one-size-fits-all rule for elections. It doesn't work with energy policy, ag policy. It certainly shouldn't work in our elections. So my key point there is we should really keep it to each individual state. Now, I can't say what happened in Arizona, what happened in Michigan. I can't talk about that. That's something I can't run for those offices because I live in North Dakota. I think with our COVID year, I think there were some irregularities in the 2020 election. I think there were laws. There were executive orders for sure all across the state, including here in North Dakota. But I think there were some lax election laws in other states. And I think all that combined, and plus having a very divisive election too, it's easy to see how the thoughts of Donald Trump versus Joe Biden could be not valid. There's been, 64, 65 court cases. Every single one of them has said Joe Biden won the election. That's all that needs to be said.
Do you? I think part of the problem, and a part of the problem is we have a former president who won't accept that he lost, and that's the bulk of the problem. But there's also something to be said about how important it is, the process is for making policy. Because I think I'm a process guy, and the reason why is when we have a fair process that everybody can participate in, even if the outcome is not the outcome you want from that process, it's easier to swallow, right? Like, I got to participate. I got to have my say. I couldn't convince enough people to go along with me, but that's how the process works. The problem is during the pandemic year, and I'm not blaming anybody for doing this, but we had a lot of policies with elections just sort of imposed. There wasn't really a debate. There wasn't, a lot of it was done by executive order, or it was done maybe through very quick legislative action, and there wasn't a lot of opportunity to debate, is this right? And I understand why we did that. We didn't have a lot of choices. We're simultaneously trying to stop the spread of this virus, but also allow American democracy to continue. So we made some decisions. Now we're trying to roll some of them back. And one of the frustrating things about this debate is, like in a place like Georgia, right, where President Joe Biden just went down and spoke, and he's being very critical of their recently implemented election laws. And they did. Georgia did roll back some of the more expansive voting policies that they had during the pandemic. But if you compare what their law is now to what it was pre-pandemic, it's easier probably to vote in Georgia now than it was before the pandemic. But because they're coming back from what we did in the pandemic, they're being accused of trying to suppress the vote. I think that's very unfair and very unfortunate. And I worry some that debate could come here to North Dakota too, Michael.
Well, in North Dakota, if you're a North Dakota resident, I think North Dakota is the easiest place in the country to vote. We don't have voter registration. I think that's something we can hang our hat on. To my knowledge, and speaking with people in the Secretary of State's office, we haven't had the irregularities that there have been across the country. The North Dakota legislature sets the law, sets the policy of how elections should be conducted. They set election law. And to me, we just haven't seen any of those problems here in North Dakota, fortunately.
So one of the things that we're seeing around the country is sort of a pulling back of vote by mail and sort of early vote. And that's something that I think has been exceptionally effective in North Dakota, at driving up our participation. I mean,
and things, by the way, we had even pre-pandemic.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But I mean, do you think that's something that we should obviously, I'm sort of leading you when I say obviously we should do this, but I mean, what is your opinion on vote by mail, early vote, and sort of expanding the timeline because there's some people in the state who will say we should just have an election on election day. We shouldn't allow people to vote for 40 days because then we have 40 days of elections. What do you think about vote by mail, early vote, and how that fits into the big picture?
Well, there's a number of counties that only do vote by mail.
Right.
And why wouldn't we continue that? I don't think there's been any issues with those vote by mail counties. The early vote, I think it's extremely popular. Here in Cass County, I think they open up 2 or 3 weeks before election day. There's a steady stream. I think there'd be much more complaints if we could only vote on the first Tuesday in November. And there's a long line. Of course, first Tuesday in November, sometimes it can be 70 degrees, sometimes it could be 7 degrees. I don't think anybody wants to wait out in line for that. So I think both those policies have been doing well. And I think as it relates to counties, the counties know how to administer the elections or how to run the elections best in their county and what works best for them. If it follows state law, I have no problem with that.
I've always been kind of a traditionalist. I like to go down to the polls on election day, and I think, but to me, it's more of an aesthetic thing. I like to be there. I like to stand in line with the folks. I like to hear what they're talking about.
You like the sticker, Rob, that they give you.
I like the sticker that they give me. I like to walk around with it. I don't know. That's how I like to vote. And so I always was kind of like, I didn't like the early voting. I don't know. I mean, it's, at some point, I'm a big believer that citizenship is a responsibility. Mm-hmm. And I feel like sometimes you should have to exercise that responsibility. And I'm worried we're getting to the point where people are going to vote on their smartphones from their couches. And I worry about what that means. But that being said, what kind of turned my head on the early voting stuff is I also don't want a blizzard to dictate an election outcome, right? I don't want, they used to talk if it's raining on election day, that's better for this candidate or that candidate. It shouldn't be that way. It shouldn't be left to just random. Election should reflect the will of the people. Not like I couldn't get to the polls because I lived 30 miles away from the polls and there was a blizzard. So I get all that. Let's talk about some of the other duties that the Secretary of State has, because the Secretary of State sits on some very consequential state boards. North Dakota Emergency Commission, and probably the big one, the Board of University and School Lands, which has been much in the news lately. What can you tell me about, those boards and your thoughts about, your approach to serving on those boards.
Yeah, the land board I think is very important. It's our natural resource oil. We've got a huge slush fund and a legacy fund, and a lot of that, the Secretary of State dictates what happens there. It funds our education. It's really the future of North Dakota is in the hands of the land board. And it's a very important duty. I think I've been a pro-energy legislator. We budget, a quarter of it comes from our natural resources, oil. So if I were to run, part of my responsibility and part of my obligation to the state would be, how do we utilize that natural resource and protect as much as possible so we can fund, I'd say, our number one priority, which is our education system.
So Representative Howe, I think during the session, from my observations, you've sort of been a workhorse, right? You're not a guy who's standing up on the floor and on all the hot button sort of issues and getting in fights with your colleagues and whatever, but you're in appropriations, you're grinding, you're bringing budgets to the floor, and I think you probably, we could use a little bit more of that in our legislature and then probably in Washington as well. But first of all, do you think that's a fair assessment of your time in the legislature? And secondly, do you think that sort of personality lends itself well to this office at this time?
Yeah, I guess you could say that's a fair assessment of my time in the legislature. I'm not one to get up. I remember my first week in the legislature. As a freshman, it says all the veterans say, you know what? Less is more, especially in your first term, because when you do have something to say, people will listen. If you're not up there firing all your bullets on inconsequential topics or stuff that's not important to your district. So I'd say that's fair. I've been fortunate enough to serve on appropriations in my second legislative session. My 2021 was my third legislative session. I think it's I don't want to say it's the right approach. Everyone has their ways of lawmaking and representing their constituents differently. To me, it's maybe a little bit of the North Dakota approach. I'm not one to brag about my accomplishments. I realize if I get into a statewide campaign, I will have to do that, which might be a little uncomfortable for me. But yeah, I'd say that's fair enough. And the right approach, I think Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, whatever, just be a decent person. And if you're passionate about something, go ahead. Yeah, get up there and stand on something. Can you be passionate about every issue? Sure. But also my advice to people, if they're considering running for a statewide office or legislature, pick and choose your battles too. You'll be more effective that way.
I think we need to elect more people who don't want to be elected, right? Like I feel like some hesitancy. I want more hesitancy. Like we have these people that they campaign for these, especially at the national level, they campaign for these offices for years and years and all this stuff. And it's like, I kind of want to I had this idea like we could press gang people into public office, right? Like just conscript them. Like they're walking out of the post office. It's like, grab them, take them to the office.
Well, that's kind of what happened to me when I ran for the legislature, Rob. Wes Belter called me up in 2016 and said, "Hey, I'm not running. I'd like for you to consider running for the state legislature." I was 29 at the time. I thought, what?
Yeah.
I said, "Can I think about this for a little bit?" I said, "This is something maybe I think I'd do when I was 45 or 55 years old." "Oh yeah, okay. Well, there's two open spots."
Because lawmakers are supposed to be old.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yep. That's what I thought. And so I hung up the phone with Wes and I thought, okay, I'm thinking about this for a few days. Well, he had it planted where I was getting calls, texts, emails from a number of different people, encouraging me to go. And like any good politician, of course, my head ballooned a little bit and thought, heck yeah, I can do this. And wrote the press release, hit send. And I thought, oh God, what did I just do? But it's been great. I love serving in the legislature. Selfishly, just the relationships I built and then the education I've got about the state of North Dakota, just been invaluable. So I maybe I was strong-armed into getting into public service.
So last question. Give us a timeline. I mean, I know you're not 100%, and I was joking around that you had told me you were going to run. I was razzing you a little bit, but what's your timeline looking at, for making the decision, I guess?
Yeah, I understand. Just to be fair to the Republican Party and finding candidates. I'm thankful for a lot of support I've had from a number of different people all across the state, but I'd say the next week or two I'll have a firm decision. Certainly, I've been having conversations with my wife and my family. I need to talk with our folks in District 22. Wouldn't want to leave the cupboard bare there either. So, still need some conversations that need to be had before I make a final decision, Rob.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, and congratulations again on the nuptials.
Oh, thank you.
Congrats.
Thank you. Thanks, Chad.
Well, we just finished up with State Representative Michael Howe talking about the possibility that he's going to run for the Secretary of State, although, Chad, I think both you and I agree. Does he come and do an interview about running for Secretary of State? If he's not running for Secretary of State, I'm not so sure. But
I think we just talked to a candidate for Secretary of State, Rob.
Yeah, who's not entirely ready. And who did? I'm very. I don't know. I think he's a heck of a candidate. I think he's going to be very good. We'll see how that race fleshes out, because we may get another Republican candidate. We may, obviously, probably eventually see a Democratic candidate. But we're going to pivot from that to talk to the House Majority Leader, Chet Pollert. Mr. Pollert has been in the House of Representatives since 1999. He's from Carrington, represents District 29. Like I said, he's the House Majority Leader, and he announced he's retiring. Leader Pollert, thanks for coming on.
You bet, Rob. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Why? Let's just start with the obvious question. Why are you retiring? What led to that decision?
It's not a short answer, but I've been fortunate in my time to have actually run now for 6 elections, and I've been fortunate with the voters of District 29 for them to put me into that. And at least for me, and I think most people are that way, when there's a time when you want to do something and when you don't. I used to work for a corporate structure many years ago, and I knew when that time was done. I used to serve on the North Dakota Grain Dealers Board. I knew when that time was done, even though I had limited out, I knew I was done. And I felt this way as far as this as well. People are going, well, you got to the top of the leadership thing. Why would you be doing that? You've got to give 100 or 110% here. And I felt I've done that. And and I also felt that I don't want to be labeled a lifer, but I'm sure there's a lot of folks say, he was a lifer. But that's fine. That's their decision. So.
Well, nobody gets to be a lifer without the will of the people, without voters giving you that chance, which is my rebuttal when people say that. Chad, you had a question.
Yeah, Representative Pollert, Chad Oben here. First of all, I want to thank you for your service. As the son of a legislator and the spouse of a legislator, I understand firsthand what you have likely given up to serve the state. So I want to thank you for that. But my question sort of is, what do you want people to remember your time in the legislature as? I mean, I would suggest that you probably had the toughest job in politics over the last 2 years and probably for the next 10 months or so. But what do you want your legacy to be?
That's a pretty loaded question, Chad. Let me go backwards a little bit, because I have 3 kids that when I started this thing 24 years ago, they were 13, 11, and 9. And so being as a kid, but now they understand the commitment to public service. When they were younger, they weren't. And there were times when there were tears flowing when I left to go to Bismarck. But now they understand that there's a commitment to public service. And not everybody understands that, but you would. And so as far as a tough year, sure it was. We're in a different time, but I also felt it was a time, normally the House and Senate argue a lot more. Yeah, we had our disagreements, but I also felt it was a time that I needed to and the House needed to work with the Senate closer too as well, because COVID just made everything tougher. And so my legacy, I'm hoping, I think we've started down the path. I will go to an article that Scott had put on Rob Port's site here over the weekend, because I do read those. And the 5 points that Scott had put on there, I'm proud of those facts that we've done that. I'm proud of the fact that we found a way, because I felt the legacy fund earnings needed to be used for legacy projects, and the bonding for the FM diversion to get off the table that. But more importantly, I think, and maybe people can say I'm wrong or not, is I wanted to be out there being fair to my colleagues, but also having them to be part of the process, knowing there's times when the buck stops at the table of what I was elected to. But at the same time, I wanted to be there treating people with respect. I've tried to do that to the best of my ability. And hopefully that's what I've done, that I was fair to the folks who come in that testify. I never stopped anybody whenever I was the chairman of the HR section to stop people from debating or telling me their point of view. And same way on the floor, I was never going to ask for the question, because those things need to be done. So being fair to people and being respectful, I hope that's what, and done good work for the state. Those are the three main things that I hopefully is what's come across.
You mentioned a little bit during that answer. You talked we're living in a different time. I think you said, or things have changed. What's changed? I mean, because you've been in office, like I said, the House since 1999. I mean, you've been there more than 2 decades. What's changed in your time in the legislature?
What I would say has changed is, and I don't want to say authority because that's not the correct way, but there's a decorum, or I don't want to say obedience either, but there's a process, and we've seen to have gotten away from that a little more. I still think the institution is in place, but I'm an old-fashioned, old tradition kind of a guy, and I believe that no matter where you are, that there should be respect for whatever side of the aisle, whatever your agreement or disagreement is, that there needs to be some respect shown, and there's a little more of that's not happening as much, and I think I missed that part of it, but that's me. But I remember sorry, Rob, but I remember times too on the floor when I got challenged on the floor when I brought a human services bill up and said that it was more than, well, that wasn't the truth, and that's fine, So it was happening back then, just not as much.
So, Representative Pollert, I think when folks think of you, they're going to think about your time as majority leader, but you were a leader in appropriations for a long, long time and did a lot of great work there. Did you miss serving in the Appropriations Committee in your role as leader?
Yes, I did. I think back to those days, back, I don't know how many years it was, probably 10 years ago or 8 years ago, I had the privilege of serving with former Representative Al Wieland and Pete Silbernagel, and still on that committee, and now he chairs it is John Nelson. Larry Ballou from Minot was on there. Representative Crate is still on there. I tell you what, I enjoyed that. But, it gets to be a camaraderie, and you can argue. I remember one time Representative Ballou and Representative Nelson were arguing in the HR section, just right back and forth. And I finally grabbed the gavel and I slammed it down. I says, this reminds me of my parents said, if I was fighting with my brothers and sisters, they'd have turned around and said, if you guys are going to continue fighting, I'm going to get the fly swatter out. I said that, and it kind of calmed things down, but that's what that's there for. And I enjoyed that. I really did. But I enjoyed the job. like I said at the media things, and I still have 10 months left of that, so I still look forward to that, even with the challenges. I said during the media thing, this was the most challenging job I've ever had. And honestly, I've owned a business. I've had to make a payroll. I had times when financially it was kind of tough, but I always made it work out and made sure, took out of my 401k to keep the business going, and it worked out. And, and so this job has been tougher than that, but it's also been the most rewarding and the most satisfying too, because I've made some good friends. There's been some tough times too, no doubt about that, and everybody's aware of that as well. But I can look back at that with a sense of pride. So I enjoy. I'm not a policy guy. Oh, I hated policy with a passion, but I did love numbers. I do love numbers, and I've always known numbers. So
you said a little bit. We've gotten a little bit away maybe from some of the past standards for decorum. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's kind of what I took from what you said a moment ago. But you also alluded to the fact that even when you started, I mean, politics has always been a business where some sharp elbows get thrown. And I think you look at even figures like Ed Schaefer, who I think has just an enormous amount of respect. I know both Ed and a man who was majority leader during Ed's time in office, another Republican, John Dorso. I know both of them very well, and they used to each tell me stories. And these stories were very divergent sometimes in their facts, but they would tell me stories about their sort of legendary fights about, the governor would be down the hall in his office and he wouldn't come to the House chamber and everybody's waiting, at the end of the session to get something done, and they get, they're shouting at each other. And to me, that was different. Like those sorts of things, you don't get if you're a good public servant, you don't get into that job if you don't care about the things that you're doing. And if you're passionate about it, then yeah, you're going to get ticked off, and maybe you're going to speak sharply at times or say something you regret. And I think we can all just sort of say, well, maybe that's not a good thing, but also accept it as it's a very human thing. I see a distinction from that versus some of what's going on. Do you see this with some of what's going on now? Do you see that same distinction?
Well, I see that distinction too. I think back as I served, I think it was one session with John Dorso, and I remember those arguments between Governor Schaefer and Majority Leader Dorso. I also know what it's like in that office, and I still think this is true to this day. If you leave the legislative session happy how it went, I don't know if you've done your job. Because I have went to people when I've come home and said, I'll be damned if I'm going to do this anymore. I'm going to be done. And by golly, you go back and then you think about, and you're ready to go again. But I finally got to that point. Things are more ruckus. I would agree with that. Is that a good thing or bad? It depends on who you talk to. I think there's a lot of folks that think, this is a wake-up call and it's got to be that way, and that's just the way it is. I don't agree with that at all. I think we need to be an environment where there's respect for folks, respect for difference of opinions. I'm one of these folks that go back to President Ronald Reagan, which I have the greatest respect, and I love reading about it. But I think of him and Speaker Tip O'Neill and how they fought like cats and dogs during the day, and at night that they could at least enjoy a snort and when I mean that, a drink, and sorry, that can be different. Now I'm showing my age here, but yet at night they were able to be friends, and I look at that way, and that's what I want to be with folks. I want to be able to fight cats and dogs, but I also want to have respect for those folks, and I hope I've done that.
Rob, it's interesting you bringing up Dorso and Schaefer, because my dad was the minority leader during that time.
That's right.
And he'd have some fun stories of watching those guys fight as, still super minority back then. But so one of the things that I've observed over the past session or two in this regard is it seems like a lot of the disagreement is far more personal now than it used to be. The emails from angry constituents are much more personal in their nature. It's not disagreeing on policy. It seems like there's some Democrats that won't talk to any Republicans, and some Republicans won't talk to somebody just because they're a Democrat. I mean, do you think it's more personal? Do you feel like people are attacking you more personally now than you did, say, 10 years ago?
Well, Chad, I can speak because of what the House went through the last session, and I can tell you for a fact the phone calls that I had on my phone and I took, and emails, and actually some things that were said to my wife, and it's gotten worse. There is no doubt about that. And you know what? You do this thing in a public service, and you're trying to do the right things, and the right thing isn't going to be the same for everybody. But you don't go after other family members and such as that. That is just wrong. You me. I understand that because that's what I got elected, and my wife reminds that. You better remember you asked for this. So, but not her,
Do you, I think you were beginning to allude to something pretty extraordinary that happened this session that had never happened before in state history, but the state house expelled a member. And it was pretty remarkable to watch. I guess as somebody who was kind of, for a while there, kind of leading the charge on that story. I got the records, I published them, I was speaking to some of the other members of the caucus and some of the other people that they say they were harassed by former state representative Luke Simons. And even I was surprised though at how quickly, I don't want to say quickly because I think that's unfair, because I think there was a good process, but I was surprised that he was expelled. Honestly, can you give us some insight into how that process played out and how it I guess felt maybe to be somebody at the crux of what frankly was a historical moment that had never happened before in state history? What was that like?
To be honest, it wasn't a lot of fun. It was not. Yeah. I did not take pleasure into going through that process, but I felt it was something that had to be done. I had office meetings with this gentleman, and I tell you what, he was perfectly a gentleman and orderly whenever I talked to him in the office. I will give him credit for that. So folks on the votes, I was surprised by the vote. But that's the way it was, and that's the way it is. So it was a very unpleasant time. It really was. Now, people think it was a vendetta. No, it was not. It wasn't a lot of fun. It really wasn't. So just so you're aware of that.
I'll tell you, I mean, I think sometimes people think in my job that I enjoy stories like that. And I'll tell you, I don't. I mean, in some ways, I guess it's good. Like, my job is to uncover things like that. But I would rather write about policy and budgets and all of those things than something like that. But sometimes circumstance thrusts it upon you and you don't have a choice. So it's when you're telling me, I guess that it wasn't a lot of fun, I can understand, because I got a lot of those same phone calls too, and emails and everything else, from people who were upset that that was happening, and it was tough. That was a tough time.
Very much so, Rob, and so now we've got folks that are still, and you'll see it in a fight for the identity of the GOP. And so they say that this is part of that culture fight. I don't think it is, but that's what they're saying. And it's affected. It'll be a fight in all the redistrictings. I better not say fight, because that sounds like it's physical, but it will be, these reorganizations are going to be interesting to follow and see the direction of the GOP.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, nobody runs for the legislature in order to expel one of their colleagues, right? I mean, that's not why you guys go there. So any suggestion that people did this on purpose, the only reason why this was happening was because Luke Simons made the decision to do some things that were really, really bad. So I think Like you, Rob, I was surprised at the outcome of this. When this all started, I assumed it'd be something that people just sort of put their heads down and try to get through, because there's so much stuff going on during a legislative session. So I think the House of Representatives deserves a lot of credit to sort of clean up their own house and did a great job. On that front of the GOP sort of fractures, I mean, where does this go, Representative Pollert? I mean, how does this end? I mean, is this just a continuous fight between the Bastiats and the, as we call them, the normals, the normies, right, Rob? I think that's what the term you use. But how does this end? It just seems like, is it just every reorganization, every district convention, it's the same fight? And you might not want to use fight, but I've seen some video where it looks like there might be fights at some of these district meetings. How do we get out of this cycle?
I don't think that's going to happen for a while. This is something, the chairman of the state GOP, Perry Schaefer, uses the words unite. I agree with that. I'm trying to do that as well, but there seems to be a faction that wants to do this, if it's ideological or whatever. But this will be here for a little while longer yet, and we'll see what happens. I like to think that whatever normal is, that normal wins out. But I've heard a podcast or two of you, calling people enemies. I don't agree with that. I am not built that way, and I will never be built that way. But it's something we're going to have to work with, and hopefully the institutionality gets back. But it's going to be a struggle.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of when I called people enemies. Was it me or we? I know we had Representative Hoverson on, and I think we talked a lot about. He was at a thing, and he was calling people enemies, and we talked a lot about that, about calling people you disagree with enemies. So I don't know.
And that we shouldn't, and that we shouldn't do that.
Right.
That we shouldn't call people we disagree with enemies.
But I'm human too, and I admit I've probably popped off at times when I've been frustrated with somebody. I think we can all do it. I think that's a human thing. I think what we've got to try to do is not recognize when we do that and realize that maybe it's not such a good thing. So I'm not exempting myself from criticism, I guess.
Well,
sorry,
I'm that way too, and I'm trying to do the best I can. And we're all humans, and personalities and tempers and all that get in the way. But hopefully, it all, I don't know what the word I'm trying to say, evens out in the end. There's times I tell you what, like Representative Beauchesne, I can look at Josh and I can talk to him, and then I'll hear something he's doing. Where is that coming from? But at the end result at the thing, I can still shake his hand at the end of the session, and then I can talk to him about issues, and we'll be, I don't want to say gentlemanly, but you know what I mean. We'll be gracious toward it, and we won't agree, but then we've got to come to a solution. This isn't all about just saying no all the time. This is about, you got to govern, and there's a difference, and there really is. And until you get into these jobs, I don't think people fully understand that it's my way or it's a highway. It doesn't work that way. In some businesses it does, but.
Do you, I honestly, talking about what we should get back to, I thought you put it very well earlier. I jotted this down when you said it. You said, I want to be able to fight like cats and dogs, but also be able to respect one another. And I think that's exactly it. In our last few minutes, you've served the state of North Dakota for over 2 decades. You're stepping aside now, and there's always another election looming, right? So somebody else will take your place. What challenges in the coming 5-10 years do you think the state of North Dakota is going to face, and people who hold your office and other offices in the legislature and the executive branch, what are they going to be facing in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I see it today with us. We worked on grid reliability. I'm a black electrons guy, thinking that needs to be the base load. We've got to continue that, but in the environment we're in, we've got to make sure the legislatures and the executive branch in the future are going to have to deal with carbon capture. we're going to have to deal with, and I think it's a good thing to, we've got to deal with the natural gas, and we're working towards that. We've got to be careful about how we do the legacy fund earnings. I'm one of those folks who believed when it was passed that fund needs to grow, because we're not going to have oil here 50 years from now, probably, or it will be drastically different than what it is today. So we need to do those investments in legacy type projects that last a long time and not balancing the budget. And we're guilty about that too as well. But those are things that we need to be working on, truly, as well as all the other issues that we have, because there's a lot of issues. I was down at Standing Rock yesterday for a tribal meeting, and yet the issues down there and the other reservations are gut-wrenching. There is no doubt about that. Water development is huge. And so it's just a lot of things that got to continue to be addressed. But I think we're going down that path. I sure hope we are.
Well, Reverend Pollert, I appreciate your time and taking your time. And like Chad started out saying, thank you for your service. I think that's really important. And I have tried to, as I, am lucky enough to get to see behind the curtain a lot and to see how serving the public in this way, I think there's a perception in the public that it's all cocktail parties and some people have that, and it's not. It is not a very glamorous job. The pay is not that great, and the amount of time it takes away from family and away from professional endeavors and fun things is enormous, and it really takes a lot of for anybody, whether I agree with their politics or not. Anybody who chooses to do this job is giving up a lot to do it, and I think we ought to be thankful for the people who choose to do it, because it's a big deal and it's important. So I guess that's my very long-winded way of saying thank you for your service. It's appreciated.
Well, I appreciate that, guys. You get thicker skinned doing this thing, but you're trying to do what's right for all the citizens of North Dakota, not for just one part or one segment. And that's where I think it kind of divides up. You're having to work over a whole spectrum of what's good for North Dakota, and I truly believe that. And hopefully I've done that to a greater degree, and hopefully that's how it's remembered.
Thank you for your time.